Sometimes the cruelest thing about losing your home is not the cold. It is beginning to believe that no light will ever be left on for you again. Emily Carter stopped counting after the seventh porch light disappeared behind another quietly locked door. Rain soaked through her pale blonde hair. The autumn wind slipped beneath her worn sweater, and every careful step reminded her that she was no longer walking only for herself. One protective hand rested over the gentle curve of her pregnant belly as she whispered the same promise she had repeated since sunrise. "I will find us somewhere safe." Earlier that morning, the council of her former pack had gathered beneath the ancient white oak where generations of Alpha, Beta, and Omega families had once celebrated weddings, harvests, and the births of new children. This time there had been no celebration, only silence. Months earlier, Emily's mate, Daniel Carter, had lost his life while helping rescue stranded hikers after a devastating mountain landslide. He had died exactly as he had lived, placing strangers before himself without hesitation. Emily had believed surviving that loss would become the hardest chapter of her life. She had been wrong. As her pregnancy became impossible to hide, frightened rumors quietly replaced sympathy. No elder ever accused her of wrongdoing because none existed. Instead, fear became its own truth. Some whispered that no child should have survived after losing a father so early. Others insisted the unborn baby carried an ancient omen that would invite endless tragedy upon the pack. Nobody offered evidence because there was none. Superstition slowly became stronger than compassion. The council reached what they called a peaceful compromise. Emily would leave before winter arrived. Officially, no one was banishing her. Unofficially, everyone understood she no longer belonged. She packed only what she could carry inside a weathered canvas bag. Several tiny baby clothes she had sewn by hand during quiet evenings. Daniel's favorite wool scarf that still carried the faint scent of cedar. A faded family photograph. A hand-knitted baby blanket made by Daniel's mother before she passed away. Years earlier, as she crossed the pack boundary without looking back, Emily quietly promised herself one thing. She would never teach her child to hate the people who had abandoned them. Fear had guided their choices. She refused to let fear guide hers. By late afternoon, heavy clouds swallowed the mountains as cold rain began falling across the narrow country roads. Emily stopped at every farmhouse she could reach before darkness settled. Some curtains quietly closed as she approached. Some porch lights disappeared without a word. One elderly woman opened her door only a few inches before lowering her eyes with visible regret. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "People are watching." Emily simply nodded and thanked her anyway. She understood. Offering shelter to an outcast Omega could cost an innocent family their standing within neighboring packs. She could not ask strangers to pay that price. As evening settled over the forest, exhaustion finally forced her to leave the road. That was when she noticed an overgrown trail almost completely hidden beneath fallen leaves. It was so narrow that most travelers would have walked past without seeing it. Yet something about the quiet path felt strangely welcoming rather than forgotten. Emily followed it nearly half a mile through towering cedar and pine until the forest suddenly opened into a peaceful clearing. There, beneath the last light of dusk, stood an old cedar house. Ivy climbed its stone chimney. Soft moss covered portions of the roof. At first glance the place appeared abandoned, yet small details quietly disagreed. Freshly split firewood rested beneath the porch overhang. Fallen leaves had been swept from the front steps. A clay flower pot beside the entrance held healthy white blossoms still blooming despite the cold. Someone still cared for this place. Emily climbed the porch slowly, not wanting to disturb whoever might live inside. She knocked gently. No answer came. She waited several moments before knocking once more. "I am sorry to bother you," she said softly through the door. "I only need somewhere dry until morning. If the answer is no, I will understand." Only the gentle rhythm of falling rain answered her. Emily sighed quietly and turned to leave. As she did, a sudden gust of wind moved through the clearing, and the old wooden door slowly drifted open behind her without a sound. She froze. Looking back, she hesitated only a moment before stepping carefully inside. Warm cedar filled the air. Books lined sturdy wooden shelves. Bundles of dried herbs hung neatly from the ceiling beams. A rocking chair faced the cold stone fireplace as though someone had stood only moments earlier. Then another scent reached her. Fresh bread. Emily's eyes slowly found a simple ceramic mug resting upon the kitchen table. She touched it gently. It was still warm. Someone had been inside the house only minutes before. "Hello," she called softly. "I do not wish to intrude." Silence answered once again. Not an empty silence. A listening one. Emily searched only the first floor, careful not to open closed doors or climb the staircase leading upstairs. Whoever lived here deserved their privacy. Fresh water waited beside the sink. Dry cedar kindling rested neatly beside the fireplace. A folded wool blanket lay across the rocking chair as though someone had expected a weary traveler long before she ever found the hidden trail. Emily quietly built a small fire using only 2 logs, determined not to waste what belonged to someone else. Sitting beside the growing warmth, she wrapped Daniel's old scarf around her shoulders before unfolding the tiny baby blanket resting inside her bag. She smiled through tired eyes and gently whispered, "Your father always believed that somewhere in every storm there was still one good person willing to leave the light on." Maybe he was right. She never noticed the almost silent footsteps above her. Behind a slightly open bedroom door, an elderly woman quietly watched the exhausted young mother below. She looked toward the white flowers blooming outside the window before softly smiling to herself. "Not the house," she whispered almost too quietly to hear. Kindness chose her the moment she thanked the 7th closed door. Emily awoke to the comforting crackle of burning cedar before she opened her eyes. For one peaceful moment, she forgot the rain, the empty roads, and every closed door she had left behind. The small fire she clearly remembered allowing to fade before falling asleep now burned steadily once again, filling the old house with gentle warmth. She slowly sat upright, one hand instinctively resting upon her growing belly. A tiny movement answered beneath her palm, making her smile. "Good morning," she whispered. "Looks like someone kept their promise to leave the light on." As she looked around the room, another surprise quietly waited for her. A thick wool quilt had been carefully wrapped around her shoulders while she slept. She stared at it in silence. She knew with complete certainty it had not been there the night before. Someone had entered the room, tended the fire, covered her with warmth, and left again without making enough noise to wake her. Instead of fear, an unexpected feeling settled over her. Gratitude. Emily carefully folded the quilt and placed it neatly back across the rocking chair exactly where she believed it belonged. "Thank you," she said softly into the quiet house. "I hope one day I can thank you properly." No answer came. Only the gentle rhythm of the fire replied. She washed her face with the fresh water waiting beside the kitchen sink before noticing a loaf of warm bread resting beneath a clean linen cloth. Beside it sat a small jar of wildflower honey and a simple wooden plate. The bread was still soft enough that steam escaped when she gently lifted the cloth. Emily immediately stepped back. None of it belonged to her. Opening her worn canvas bag, she searched through the few belongings she still carried and found the last bright red apple she had saved for the journey ahead. Daniel had picked it from a tree beside their tiny cottage only a few days before the landslide, insisting it would stay fresh longer than she expected. She had been saving it because throwing away the final thing he had touched somehow felt impossible. Emily looked at the apple for several quiet seconds before placing it beside the loaf of bread. "He always believed that sharing the last thing you have never makes you poorer," she whispered with a faint smile. "I think he would want me to leave this here." She cut herself only one small slice of bread, spread a little honey across it, and silently thanked both Daniel and the unseen stranger who had somehow cared for her without asking a single question. After breakfast, she carefully washed the wooden plate, dried it, and returned everything exactly as she had found it. Before stepping outside, she swept the front porch with an old broom resting beside the doorway. It felt wrong to accept so much kindness without offering any in return. The morning air smelled wonderfully fresh after the storm. Emily gathered several fallen branches scattered around the clearing, hoping to replace at least some of the firewood she had already used. As she reached the old chopping block, she stopped in surprise. A new stack of freshly split cedar logs had appeared overnight. The pail wood still carried the clean fragrance released only moments after an axe touched it. Someone had been working nearby while she slept. Emily slowly turned toward the surrounding forest. Sunlight filtered peacefully through the towering trees, but no movement greeted her. Only birdsong drifted gently across the clearing. Carrying a small armful of branches back toward the porch, she noticed another quiet change. The apple she had left beside the bread had disappeared. In its place stood one of the same white flowers blooming outside the front door, resting inside a small glass bottle filled with fresh water. Emily gently picked it up, smiling despite herself. Whoever lived here had accepted her gift without a single spoken word. She carried the flower to the front window where sunlight reached the table each morning before taking a small sheet of paper from her sewing kit. In careful handwriting, she wrote only one sentence. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists when nobody is watching." She folded the note and tucked it beneath the little glass bottle before returning outside to gather more kindling. High above, behind the lace curtain of the upstairs bedroom, Margaret quietly watched the young woman walk toward the forest carrying far fewer branches than she truly needed. Still thinking of others before herself, she murmured with gentle approval. She looked toward the note resting beneath the flower, then carefully descended the staircase for the first time since Emily arrived. Margaret picked up the folded paper, read every word, and smiled warmly before slipping it into a small wooden box already filled with dozens of similar notes collected over many decades. "Not yet," she whispered softly as she returned upstairs. "Trust grows one quiet kindness at a time." 3 quiet mornings passed before Emily stopped wondering whether the old cedar house was mysterious and began accepting that it was simply full of extraordinary people. Every sunrise greeted her with a freshly tended fire. Every evening another neat stack of cedar appeared beside the porch. Whenever she quietly noticed something needing repair, it somehow looked better the following morning. A loose shutter no longer rattled in the wind. The rain barrel stopped leaking. Even the worn porch step that had shifted beneath her weight on the first night had been carefully reinforced. Emily never caught anyone working. She only witnessed the results of hands that seemed to prefer kindness over recognition. Instead of searching for the unseen caretaker, she chose to become part of the same quiet rhythm. She swept the wooden floors every morning, dusted the bookshelves, polished the old kitchen table, and opened the windows long enough for fresh mountain air to carry away the scent of smoke. She mended a torn kitchen towel with the sewing kit she always carried and repaired a loose cabinet hinge using several old nails she found inside a workbench drawer. Every evening, she baked enough bread for 2 instead of 1. Every morning half of it quietly disappeared before she awoke. The silent exchange slowly became a conversation without words. One afternoon, while preparing vegetable soup over the fireplace, Emily glanced toward the ceiling and smiled. "The herbs near the creek are almost ready," she said aloud without expecting an answer. "They should be dried before the first frost." The next morning bundles of those very herbs hung neatly from the ceiling beams, already tied with fresh twine. Emily laughed softly to herself. "I suppose you really were listening." She baked another loaf that afternoon and placed it beneath the white flower beside the window. This time she folded another small note beside it. "Thank you for helping someone you have never met. Whoever you are, I hope life has been just as kind to you." Before leaving to gather wild sage near the edge of the clearing, she gently touched Daniel's old scarf resting across the back of her chair. "You would have liked this place," she whispered. "You always said the best people were the ones who never needed credit for doing the right thing." When Emily returned shortly before sunset, the bread had disappeared once again. Her note was gone as well. In its place rested a small wooden carving of a mother wolf curled around a sleeping pup. The carving was simple, smooth from years of careful polishing, yet every detail carried remarkable tenderness. Emily held it carefully, unexpectedly reminded of Daniel's habit of carving little animals from fallen cedar branches during quiet evenings outside their cottage. She smiled through tears. "I wish you could see her someday," she whispered, resting one hand gently over her unborn daughter. Upstairs, Margaret quietly heard every word. She looked toward a weathered wooden box resting beside her bed. Inside lay dozens of folded notes collected across nearly 50 years from frightened mothers who had once found shelter beneath the same roof. Emily's newest note now rested among them. Margaret smiled gently before closing the lid. "Still thanking strangers," she murmured, even after the world forgot how to thank her. Late that afternoon, another sound finally reached the clearing. Horses. Emily walked quietly to the upstairs window and looked through the trees. A small royal escort slowly followed the narrow trail leading toward the house. At their front rode a tall man whose dark traveling coat carried no jeweled ornaments despite the royal crest embroidered upon one shoulder. Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks had left the capital 3 days earlier carrying only one weathered map preserved inside the royal archives and one promise given to him years before by his father. On the evening before his coronation, the old king had placed the faded journal into Nathaniel's hands and quietly said, "One day you may discover a house that belongs to no kingdom. If you ever find it, remember this. The house is not waiting for a king. It is waiting to discover whether the king remembers how to become a guest." Nathaniel had never forgotten those words. As the hidden clearing slowly appeared before him, he noticed something the old drawings inside the archives had never shown. White flowers bloomed beside the porch. Fresh bread cooled upon the windowsill. Someone had brought life back to the forgotten refuge. From the upstairs window, Emily watched the strangers approach, while Margaret quietly stepped beside her for the first time without making a sound. Neither woman spoke. Margaret simply studied the young king below with calm, patient eyes. "Now," she whispered almost imperceptibly, "we shall see whether his father taught him well." The royal escort stopped at the edge of the clearing exactly as the ancient trail ended. Nathaniel raised one quiet hand, signaling the 4 guards behind him to remain where they were. None questioned the order. During the journey from the capital, they had watched their king study the weathered journal from the royal archives every evening beside the campfire. They all knew this mission was unlike any other. Nathaniel slowly dismounted and looked toward the cedar house standing peacefully beneath the towering pines. It looked smaller than he had imagined, yet somehow more alive than any sketch preserved inside the archives. White flowers bloomed beneath the front windows. Thin ribbons of smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney. Fresh bread rested upon the windowsill beside a small glass bottle holding a single white blossom. Every detail quietly declared that this was not an abandoned house. It was a loved one. The younger guard standing nearest him spoke in a respectful whisper. "Your Majesty, shall we announce your arrival?" Nathaniel kept his eyes on the house. No, the guard looked surprised. "But if someone inside needs protection," Nathaniel smiled faintly, "then the greatest protection I can offer is allowing them to choose whether they wish to meet me." Those words reminded the older captain beside him of the late king. He quietly nodded, understanding immediately. Nathaniel reached into his saddlebag and removed a small cloth bundle prepared before leaving the capital. Inside rested a bottle of fresh goat's milk from the royal dairy, several crisp apples from the palace orchard, a packet of herbal tea blended by the royal healers for expectant mothers, and a handwritten recipe for nourishing vegetable soup copied from his own mother's journal. None of the gifts carried the royal seal. Nathaniel had specifically ordered that nothing should make the family inside feel indebted to the crown. He climbed the porch alone and gently placed the bundle beside the loaf of bread without knocking. Before stepping away, he noticed a small wooden carving resting near the flower. It showed a mother wolf protecting a sleeping pup. Beneath it lay another folded note written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for helping someone you have never met. Whoever you are, I hope life has been just as kind to you." Nathaniel read the sentence only once before carefully placing it back exactly where he had found it. He smiled quietly to himself. "Whoever you are," he murmured almost inaudibly, "I hope life has been kinder to you than it has been to the woman you welcomed." Without waiting for a reply, he stepped off the porch and returned to the edge of the clearing. Hidden behind the kitchen doorway, Emily had watched everything. The stranger had not tried to open the door. He had not called out. He had not searched the house. Instead, he had quietly left gifts meant for someone he had never met and walked away. She looked down at the cloth bundle resting beside the bread, then gently touched Daniel's scarf around her shoulders. "You would have liked him," she whispered. "He gives the way you used to." Upstairs, Margaret had watched every moment through the lace curtain. A warm smile slowly crossed her face before she quietly descended the staircase carrying a small basket of freshly baked rolls. Emily looked up in surprise as the elderly woman finally stepped into the light for the first time. "You?" Emily whispered softly. Margaret nodded. "Yes, child." She looked toward the porch where Nathaniel now stood speaking quietly with his escort. "I have been waiting to meet you." Emily's eyes filled with emotion. "Why now?" Margaret placed the basket gently upon the kitchen table before answering. Because I needed to know two things. She looked first toward Emily. Whether kindness could survive after your heart was broken. Then she looked through the window toward Nathaniel. And whether humility could survive beneath a crown. Emily followed her gaze toward the young king, standing patiently beyond the clearing. Did he pass? Margaret's gentle smile widened. Not yet. She looked at the untouched bundle still resting on the porch. The lesson is not finished. At that very moment, Nathaniel quietly noticed movement behind the kitchen window. Although he could not see the faces clearly, he caught the brief outline of two women standing together. Instead of approaching, he respectfully lowered his head in greeting, turned away, and began helping one of his guards gather fallen branches for their own evening fire, leaving the bundle exactly where it was, never expecting thanks. Emily stood quietly beside the kitchen table, her eyes lingering on the simple cloth bundle Nathaniel had left behind. She slowly untied the string and looked inside. Fresh goat's milk rested beside several bright red apples, a packet of fragrant herbal tea, and a carefully folded recipe written in neat handwriting. There was no royal seal, no signature, and no message reminding anyone who had provided the gifts. It was simply help, offered without expecting recognition. Emily smiled faintly. He wanted whoever lived here to believe it came from a neighbor, she said softly. Margaret nodded with quiet approval. His father taught him well. Emily looked toward the elderly woman. You knew his father? Margaret smiled as she carefully poured warm tea into 2 cups. King William found this house almost 30 years ago. He arrived the same way his son did. For guards. 1 old journal. No pride. She handed Emily one of the steaming cups before continuing. He waited outside for an entire day because he believed frightened people deserved time to decide whom they could trust. Before he left, he made one promise. Margaret's expression softened as she remembered. He told me the crown would never own this house. It would only make certain no one else ever could. Emily looked toward the front window where Nathaniel and his escort were quietly building their own small campfire well beyond the clearing instead of settling near the porch. He is keeping that promise, she whispered. Margaret nodded. That is why I finally stepped downstairs today. Emily hesitated before asking the question that had quietly remained in her heart since the first morning. Did the house really choose me? Margaret laughed gently, the warm sound filling the quiet room. People have been telling that story for generations, she said. It is a beautiful story, but it is still only a story. Emily looked at her with surprise. Margaret walked toward the window, overlooking the white flowers blooming beneath the porch. There is nothing magical about this house, child. The miracle has always been ordinary people keeping an extraordinary promise. She turned back toward Emily. Every keeper watches from upstairs. We never introduce ourselves immediately. We simply observe. Emily listened carefully. Margaret continued with gentle honesty. I watched you arrive after the 7th closed door. I watched you thank the elderly woman who could not help you instead of blaming her. I watched you use only 2 pieces of firewood although you were freezing. I watched you sweep a porch that did not belong to you. I watched you give away the last apple your husband had ever touched before accepting a single slice of bread. Emily lowered her eyes, overwhelmed. Margaret smiled kindly. People say the house chooses its keeper. The truth is much simpler. Every keeper quietly waits for someone who still chooses kindness after the world has forgotten to be kind to them. Tears quietly gathered in Emily's eyes. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt as though someone had truly seen her, not only her pain, but the choices she had continued making despite it. She reached into her travel bag and carefully unfolded Daniel's old cedar-colored scarf. Holding it gently, she smiled through her tears. He always believed kindness should be the first thing people noticed about us. Margaret touched the edge of the scarf with great care. Then he is still helping this child grow, even now. Emily looked toward the tiny baby clothes folded neatly inside her bag. I wish he could have met his daughter. Margaret rested one comforting hand over Emily's. The people we lose never stop shaping the people we become. Your daughter will know her father because she will see him every time you choose compassion over bitterness. Emily quietly nodded. The ache of missing Daniel remained, but for the first time it no longer felt empty. Outside, Nathaniel happened to glance toward the upstairs window while gathering firewood for his escort. Through the lace curtain, he caught only the faint outline of two women standing together. He smiled quietly before looking away, careful not to invade a private moment. "Your Majesty," the older captain said gently, "would you like me to take the supplies closer to the house before sunset?" Nathaniel shook his head. "No. If they need more, they already know where to find us. Trust grows slowly. Let us not hurry it." From the upstairs window, Margaret happened to witness the exchange. She smiled to herself before softly whispering, "Yes, William, your son remembered." The evening settled gently over the clearing as golden light faded behind the towering pines. Emily sat beside the fireplace with Daniel's cedar-colored scarf folded across her lap, while Margaret quietly prepared supper in the old kitchen. The comforting scent of vegetable soup slowly filled the house, mixed with fresh bread and herbs drying above the hearth. Outside, Nathaniel and his escort had built a modest camp well beyond the clearing, careful not to intrude upon the quiet refuge. Emily looked toward the front window where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I think he has been standing out there longer than necessary," she said softly. Margaret smiled without looking up from the pot she was stirring. "He is not waiting for permission to enter." She paused before adding, "He is waiting for you to stop wondering whether he expects it." Emily quietly considered those words. She had spent so much of her life surrounded by people who believed power granted them the right to cross every boundary. Nathaniel had done the opposite. Every choice he made quietly protected hers. Margaret carried 2 bowls of soup to the table before opening a small wooden cabinet beside the fireplace. From the highest shelf, she carefully removed an old leather journal tied with a faded blue ribbon. Emily immediately recognized it as different from the blue journal downstairs. This one appeared much older. Margaret gently placed it upon the table and opened the first page. "Every keeper records the lives of the mothers who find this house," she explained. "But every king writes only 1 page." Emily looked down at the careful handwriting filling nearly 2 centuries of entries. Each page carried the name of a different ruler. None spoke about authority, victories, or laws. Instead, every king had written a single promise. "I left the house exactly as I found it. I protected its silence. I remembered that compassion belongs to no throne." Emily slowly turned another page until she reached the final completed entry. It belonged to King William Brooks. The handwriting matched the quiet confidence Margaret had described earlier. "If my son ever reaches this house, judge him only after he believes no one is watching." Emily closed the journal gently. Suddenly, she understood why Nathaniel had never been tested by impossible trials or dramatic choices. The test had already begun the moment he entered the clearing believing he was alone. Margaret smiled knowingly. Character is easiest to recognize when gratitude is impossible. Emily looked toward the window again. Nathaniel had quietly finished stacking firewood beside his own camp. Instead of resting, he noticed several broken fence rails near the far edge of the abandoned garden surrounding the house. Without saying a word, he gathered loose cedar boards left beneath a nearby shed and carefully repaired the small fence before darkness completely settled over the clearing. He never walked closer than necessary. He never looked toward the windows to see whether anyone had noticed. When he finished, he quietly returned to his own campfire as though the work itself had been reward enough. Emily watched every moment in complete silence. Margaret noticed the tears gathering quietly in her eyes. "Now you understand," she said softly. Emily nodded. "He fixes things the same way Daniel did." She smiled through the emotion rising inside her chest. Not because someone asked him to, because he could not walk past something broken without trying to leave it better. Margaret reached across the table and gently covered Emily's hand. "Then perhaps your daughter will grow up knowing 2 remarkable men," she whispered. "One through memory, one through example." Emily lowered her eyes to Daniel's scarf resting across her lap. "I was afraid loving his memory meant I could never open my heart to trusting anyone again." Margaret gently shook her head. "Love is not replaced, child. It teaches us how to recognize goodness when it appears again." Before Emily could answer, another steady tightening spread gently across her abdomen. It lasted longer than the ones before, though it remained calm rather than frightening. Margaret immediately recognized the quiet change. She neither hurried nor showed concern. She simply smiled with the peaceful confidence of long experience. She is letting us know she will not keep us waiting much longer. At that exact moment, 3 soft knocks echoed against the front door. Emily instinctively looked toward Margaret, expecting Nathaniel at last. Margaret listened for only a heartbeat before smiling. "No," she said gently. "That is someone who has never been here before." Emily slowly opened the front door. Standing upon the porch was a young Omega mother soaked by the evening rain, one small frightened boy hiding behind her coat exactly as Emily herself had stood only a week earlier. Without hesitation, Emily stepped aside, smiled warmly, and spoke the words she had once longed to hear herself. "Please come inside. You do not have to face tonight alone." The frightened young Omega stood frozen beneath the porch roof, rainwater dripping from her pale hair, while the little boy beside her clung tightly to her hand. He could not have been older than 4. His oversized coat hung nearly to his ankles, and his frightened blue eyes searched Emily's face with the same uncertainty she herself had carried only days earlier. Before the young woman could apologize for arriving uninvited, Emily remembered standing on that very porch after 7 closed doors had almost convinced her that kindness no longer existed. She stepped aside immediately. "Please come inside," she said warmly. "You do not have to face tonight alone." The young Omega looked at her in disbelief before quietly whispering, "Thank you." Margaret smiled from beside the fireplace as though she had been expecting them all evening. Without asking a single question, she handed the little boy a warm blanket before pouring fresh vegetable soup into 2 bowls. Within minutes, the child had fallen asleep in the rocking chair, still holding a small wooden toy wolf Margaret had quietly taken from a nearby shelf. Emily watched him with gentle eyes, realizing that the house had once done exactly the same thing for her. It had offered warmth before questions, safety before explanations. Margaret carried another log to the fire before looking toward Emily. "Now you understand why the promise has survived so long," she said softly. Emily nodded. "Because every person who is welcomed learns how to welcome someone else." Margaret smiled with quiet satisfaction. Exactly. Outside, Nathaniel noticed the front door remain open longer than usual. Through the warm light spilling across the porch, he briefly saw another young woman step inside carrying a frightened child. He quietly lowered his eyes, understanding immediately what had happened. Without speaking, he returned to his saddlebag and removed several more blankets, another packet of dried vegetables, children's storybooks collected from the Royal Library, and a small pouch of apple seeds gathered from the oldest orchard beside the palace chapel. He walked only as far as the porch, leaving everything neatly beside the entrance before stepping back once again. As he turned away, the older captain quietly smiled. "Your Majesty," he said, "you keep giving away everything we packed." Nathaniel looked back toward the warmly lit house. "That is because none of it truly belonged to me." The captain nodded. He had served Nathaniel's father long enough to recognize the same quiet wisdom. Inside, Emily opened the front door a few moments later and discovered the new supplies waiting where Nathaniel had left them. Resting on top of the blankets was the small pouch of apple seeds. She gently smiled, remembering the single apple she had offered during her very first morning in the house. Without realizing it, tears quietly filled her eyes. Margaret noticed immediately. "Do you remember what you told me?" she asked softly. Emily nodded. "Daniel always believed sharing the last thing you have never makes you poorer." Margaret opened the little cloth pouch and poured the tiny apple seeds gently into Emily's hand. "Then his kindness has come home," she said. "One day those seeds will become shade for children who have not even been born yet." Emily closed her fingers around them carefully, as though holding something far more valuable than seeds. They were proof that one small act of generosity never truly disappeared. It simply waited until someone else carried it forward. Another stronger wave of labor gently interrupted her thoughts. Emily breathed slowly, just as Margaret had taught her. The discomfort no longer frightened her because she knew she was surrounded by people who expected nothing in return for their compassion. Margaret quietly helped her settle beside the fireplace before placing Daniel's cedar-colored scarf across her lap. "Your daughter will know where she came from," Margaret whispered. "She will know her father through your stories, and she will know what kind of man he was every time she sits beneath the apple tree that grows from these seeds." Emily smiled through grateful tears. At that moment, she realized she was no longer simply receiving the promise that had protected generations of frightened mothers. She had already begun becoming part of it. Outside, Nathaniel looked once more toward the glowing windows. Before preparing to leave at first light, he had come searching for a forgotten house. Instead, he had found something far more important. He had found a promise worth protecting for the rest of his life. Morning arrived wrapped in quiet golden light as the last traces of rain disappeared from the cedar branches surrounding the hidden clearing. Inside the old house, the frightened young Omega and her little boy still slept peacefully beside the fireplace, the child holding the little carved wolf against his chest as though he had known it all his life. Emily rested comfortably in the rocking chair near the window, breathing slowly through each stronger wave that came and went with steady rhythm. Margaret remained beside her, never hurried, never anxious, simply offering calm encouragement earned through decades of welcoming new life into the same warm home. "You are doing beautifully," she whispered. "Your daughter already knows she is arriving where she has always been wanted." Emily smiled softly despite the effort. Her eyes wandered toward the little pouch of apple seeds resting beside Daniel's folded scarf on the nearby table. "He always wanted an orchard," she murmured. "Daniel used to say children should grow up climbing trees instead of fearing storms." Margaret gently placed her hand over the scarf. "Then one day your daughter will sit beneath those trees and hear every story you have to tell about him." Emily nodded, feeling that for the first time since Daniel's death, remembering him no longer brought only grief. It brought gratitude. His kindness had quietly guided every decision that eventually led her to this house. Outside the clearing, Nathaniel quietly prepared his horse while the royal escort gathered their camp. Before leaving, he opened the weathered journal from the royal archives one final time. The final blank page remained waiting beneath the words written by his father many years earlier. Nathaniel carefully uncapped his fountain pen and added only a single sentence. "The house still stands because ordinary people continue choosing compassion when no one is watching." He closed the journal gently before handing it to the older captain. "Return this to the archives," he said. "Let every king after me remember the same lesson." The captain accepted it with quiet respect. "And the location, Your Majesty?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Will remain exactly where it belongs." He tapped the closed journal. "In the promise. Never on the map." At that same moment, another steady contraction passed through Emily. Margaret quietly nodded. "It is time." The house became peacefully busy. Fresh blankets were laid beside the fire. Warm water rested nearby. The young Omega who had arrived the night before quietly helped however she could, grateful simply to return a fraction of the kindness she had received. No one gave orders. Everyone simply knew what needed to be done. Hours passed beneath gentle sunlight filtering through the windows until, at last, a clear newborn cry filled the old cedar house. Every conversation stopped. Every face quietly smiled. Margaret carefully placed the tiny baby girl into Emily's waiting arms before stepping back to allow mother and daughter their first peaceful moment together. Emily looked down through joyful tears at the tiny face resting against the same hand-knitted blanket Daniel's mother had made years before. She gently wrapped Daniel's cedar-colored scarf beneath the blanket, smiling softly. "Your father cannot hold you," she whispered, "but you will always carry a piece of him." Margaret watched in respectful silence before quietly opening the front door. Morning sunlight poured across the porch just as Nathaniel prepared to ride away. Seeing Margaret standing there, he respectfully removed his hat. Without speaking, Margaret stepped forward holding the newborn just long enough for the warm sunlight to touch the child's peaceful face. Nathaniel bowed his head, not to royalty, not to tradition, but to new life itself. Margaret smiled gently. She arrived exactly where she belonged. Nathaniel looked at the child before meeting Margaret's eyes. "And so did I," he answered quietly. Margaret nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Yes," she said, "not because you found the house." She glanced toward Emily holding her daughter inside. "Because when you believed no one could see you, you chose kindness anyway." Nathaniel understood at last. The house had never tested courage. It had never tested power. It had only revealed character. Smiling softly, he mounted his horse and prepared to leave. Before turning toward the forest, he looked once more at the little pouch of apple seeds resting beside the front window. "Plant them," he called gently. "Someday another child will need their shade." Emily smiled through happy tears and lifted the pouch in quiet promise. As Nathaniel disappeared beyond the trees, Margaret looked toward the peaceful clearing and whispered almost to herself, "The promise lives on." Emily held her newborn daughter against her heart as peaceful morning light filled every corner of the old cedar house. The tiny girl slept quietly beneath the hand-knitted blanket Daniel's mother had made years before, while his cedar-colored scarf rested gently beneath her, just as Emily had promised. For the first time since losing him, Emily realized that love had not ended with his absence. It had quietly continued shaping every choice she made, leading her one small act of kindness at a time to the place where their daughter would begin her own story. Margaret poured 2 cups of warm herbal tea before joining Emily beside the fireplace. Neither woman spoke for several moments. The silence between them carried the comfortable weight of understanding rather than unfinished words. At last, Margaret looked toward the blue journal resting upon the kitchen table. "Its final page is still waiting," she said gently. Emily smiled, carefully settled her daughter in the rocking chair beside her, and opened the weathered journal. She read the stories left by generations of frightened mothers who had arrived believing they had reached the end of hope. Then, on the final empty page, she slowly began to write. "I believed 7 closed doors meant the world had forgotten me. I was wrong. One open door changed not only my life, but my daughter's first breath. If you are reading this because you believe you have nowhere left to go, keep walking. There are still people who choose compassion before judgment. When you find them, become one of them." Emily gently closed the journal and tied the faded blue ribbon once more. Margaret smiled with quiet pride. Now it belongs to the next generation. Emily looked at her with gentle confusion. Margaret reached into the pocket of her apron and removed the old iron key tied to its familiar blue ribbon. She carefully placed it into Emily's hand. This time Emily did not try to return it. She already understood. 50 years ago, Margaret said softly, I arrived here carrying nothing but fear. The keeper before me watched quietly from upstairs, just as I watched you. She taught me the same lesson I have tried to teach you. A refuge is never built from wood and stone. It is built every time one person decides another stranger deserves to feel safe. Emily closed her fingers around the old key, feeling the countless lives that promise had quietly touched before reaching her. Will you leave now? She asked gently. Margaret smiled and looked toward the white flowers blooming beneath the front window. No, she answered. Not yet. I promised I would stay long enough to help plant the orchard. Emily looked toward the little pouch of apple seeds Nathaniel had left behind. Together, later that afternoon, they walked into the clearing carrying a small shovel. The frightened young Omega who had arrived during the storm joined them, her little boy proudly carrying the pouch of seeds with both hands. Margaret showed them where the sunlight stayed longest through the changing seasons. Emily knelt carefully and placed the first seed into the earth. This one is for Daniel, she whispered with a peaceful smile. She planted the second seed beside it. This one is for every mother still searching for a light in the darkness. Nathaniel watched quietly from the edge of the forest before preparing to leave. He never interrupted the moment. Instead, he removed one folded sheet of paper from inside his coat and walked only as far as the porch. He placed it beneath the little glass bottle holding the white flower, exactly where Emily had once left her very first note. Then he turned toward his horse without knocking. After he disappeared among the trees, Emily found the folded paper waiting. Beneath the flower, opening it slowly, she immediately recognized her own handwriting. It was the very first note she had written on her second morning in the house. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists when nobody is watching. Nathaniel had written only one sentence beneath it. I thought the next keeper should keep the first promise she ever made here. Emily pressed the note gently against her heart before placing it inside the blue journal. Beside it, she tucked Daniel's photograph, knowing both would remain there for every future keeper to discover. Weeks slowly became months. Winter quietly surrendered to spring, and tiny green shoots emerged where the apple seeds had been planted. The white flowers returned beside the porch exactly as they always had. Margaret carefully taught Emily every tradition that could not be found inside the journals, then slowly stepped back, allowing the younger woman to welcome each traveler herself. The old keeper had never possessed the promise. She had simply carried it until someone else was ready. Years later, Laughter echoed beneath the branches of young apple trees where Emily's daughter played with the little boy who had once arrived frightened on a rainy evening. Neither child remembered a world where strangers were first met with suspicion. They had grown up believing warm bread belonged on every table, an extra blanket should always wait by the fire, and no frightened traveler should ever have to knock twice. One cold autumn evening, another young Omega appeared at the end of the hidden trail carrying a worn canvas bag and the weight of too many closed doors. She stopped before the familiar porch, uncertain whether hope truly existed behind one more door. Before she could gather the courage to knock again, it quietly opened. Emily stood smiling beneath the warm lantern light, while her daughter placed a fresh loaf of bread beside the white flowers blooming in the front window. The scent of cedar drifted through the open doorway. A warm ceramic mug rested beside the fire. Behind Emily, Margaret sat peacefully in the old rocking chair, no longer the keeper, simply a welcome guest watching another beginning unfold. Emily stepped aside exactly as she had once been welcomed herself and spoke the words that had crossed generations without ever losing their meaning. Welcome home. We have been expecting you. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.